The subcommittee will come to order. Thanks for being here today, Commandant. It's just you right now. This is good. The subcommittee is meeting today to pick up from where we left off from our June 7th hearing on Coast Guard infrastructure. An important aspect of the previous hearing was the Coast Guard stating it would submit its unfunded priority list, the 5-year capital improvement plan, and the long-term major acquisition plan to the committee. Unfortunately, as of today's hearing, we only have received the unfunded priority list and a chart from the 5-year capital improvement plan, but at least it's something. The members of this subcommittee are some of the strongest supporters of the Coast Guard, with a number of us also serving on the Armed Services Committee, which allows us to push for Coast Guard priorities in parity with the other armed forces. It can be frustrating and difficult to advocate for service priorities and funding needs when we lack specific Coast Guard documents that can best inform congressional decisions on Coast Guard acquisitions programs. With its aging fleet of cutters and aircraft, the Coast Guard has implemented extensive maintenance and life extension projects for its assets in order to do more with less capable assets. In addition, new assets such as the national security cutters and the fast response cutters have experienced ongoing issues which reduce their capabilities and further exacerbate the service's ability to conduct its missions. It is very likely that the Coast Guard assets will reach the end of their service life before replacements are in place. The threat of mission gaps is a very real possibility. The service will continue to tell us otherwise and present charts that show less substantial gaps, but I still believe the service charts are based on wishful thinking, not fiscal reality, and we'll represent that with a slide here once the hearing really begins. While it hasn't been the fault of the U.S. Coast Guard that severe budgets have curtailed or delayed acquisitions programs, the service can be faulted for a lack of detail on the impacts of a stagnant budget on acquisition programs and subsequently on its ability to carry out its missions. The fact that the mission needs statement, a 5-year capital improvement plan, and the fleet mix analysis do not fully tell the story of the Coast Guard's short-term and long-term gaps or its plan to address them has been an ongoing concern. GAO has pointed out in a number of reports that the Coast Guard should develop a long-term plan to influence its short-term planning documents. In 2016, Congress required the development of the 20-year major acquisition plan since it was clear the service was not going to do one on its own. However, it's been a year and a half since the requirement was enacted into law, and we still have not received a long-term plan from the Coast Guard. How important is long-term planning to the Coast Guard? I really can't say. We on the committee believe long-term planning documents can assist the Coast Guard in getting its acquisition programs funded. It is disappointing that we only have the unfunded priorities list to discuss today without the 5-year and 20-year planning documents that should fill in the blanks and provide a roadmap for the future. It's hard to understand any of these documents by themselves because they're not in context. There's no perspective without a 20-year plan. Regardless, we will continue to have these important discussions with the service. I look forward to hearing from our witness today on how we can best address the Coast Guard's infrastructure needs. I will now yield to Ranking Member Garamendi. Recognize.
You want me to go to Fazio first?
For an opening statement to you, and then.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Admiral. Welcome. Delighted that you're with us. We do have some questions. I felt that our priority hearing on this topic in early June laid out the groundwork for future substantive discussions, and it was my expectation that that would happen today. I'm not at all sure, however. It's manifestly frustrating, again, to not have the Coast Guard provide the budget committee with the capital planning and budget information the Coast Guard is required by statute to provide to this committee. And to make no mistake about it, this committee is deprived of critical information when both the 5-year and 20-year capital investment programs are not forthcoming. I do notice that something at 5:47 was delivered to us yesterday. The absence of these documents makes it difficult, if not impossible, to understand and appreciate the budget trade-offs among the acquisition programs. Moreover, this gap in information compromises our ability to flag programs that have gone off budget, or to ensure that taxpayer dollars are invested as wisely as possible to maintain the Coast Guard mission readiness and capability. As I mentioned in my remarks on the June 3rd hearing, the Coast Guard has an enduring role in protecting our shores and in facilitating our maritime commerce. When we talk about ensuring the future prosperity and security of our nation, few things are as important as providing the Coast Guard with the equipment it needs. When this subcommittee is not provided essential information to fully understand the complexities of these expensive and important procurements, however, it makes it that much more difficult for the members of the subcommittee to advocate and build greater support in Congress for the Coast Guard's budget. Trying to understand a document that was delivered late yesterday, then I saw for the first time this morning when I arrived here. For example, the polar icebreaker. 19 million in 18, or is it 5 million? 50 million, 150, 430, and then 300. That's maybe one icebreaker. What about the other 3, or the other 2, or the other 5? We cannot do our work without good information, Admiral, and we don't have it. And so, I guess I'm resigned to having to lower my expectations for the future of the Coast Guard. I don't want to do that, but you don't leave me much option. It's a missed opportunity. We have to make decisions very soon about the federal budget for 2018. The appropriations are on the floor, maybe today, for the Homeland Security Department. And this is the information we have available to us. To the extent, Admiral, that you and Admiral Hancock can fill in the blanks today, would you please do so? As to our other witnesses, welcome. I look forward to your testimony on these important matters, and let's hope that we're not further disappointed. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to go out of order here and recognize the ranking member of the full committee because we're blessed to have him here in this hearing. Mr. DeFazio is recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I would certainly endorse the remarks of my colleague, the ranking member, Mr. Garamendi. I think it was 4 or 5 years ago when we were doing Coast Guard budget hearing, I asked your predecessor, this is it? I mean, at that point, you didn't even list the icebreakers on there, and having been on the icebreaker and having known, you know, the fact that one was mothballed and the other one is, you know, basically limping along, I was surprised, and I said, I hope that next year you'll bring in a more complete list of your needs. I know there's a lot of pressure from the trolls at OMB or others in the administration, but if you don't advocate for the service, we can't advocate for the service, and at some point we've got to break this. We've got to break this logjam. You know, I don't know where. I don't think it's within the service that there's this reluctance. I don't know exactly where the problem lies. But we need the information, and as Mr. Garamendi pointed out, I mean, it's very puzzling that we finally got the polar icebreaker on the list, but that looks like maybe, as he said, perhaps one. And, you know, obviously you have many, many, many other needs that are not reflected on this one-page summary. So we really need, and later when we're in questions, I'll be asking if others don't, when we are going to get the 5-year, when we are going to get the 20-year. I also intend to follow up on the questions that I raised regarding the closure of the Potomac River. This is a fairly unique situation. We have individual dispersed recreation, some of it commercial, some of it, much of it commercial, rented, but some of it guided. You have a camp for a youth camp, that would be affected because they use that section of river. And this is not your normal maritime situation where people have marine radios and that. I do note in your letter that you say that individuals can apply to the captain of the port and get individual authorization. You know, that would be people in inner tubes, I guess, and I'm not sure how that would work. I guess they, you know, maybe they can call in on their cell phone or something like that. But you know, I just don't see. I know the Secret Service is always difficult to deal with. That I think you could assure security without a total intermittent and unpredictable closure, because you're going to strand people. I mean, if you know someone is, you know, if, as I pointed out, the president could play on his other 18-hole course where it wasn't next to the river, where he didn't cut down all the trees, and that could satisfy his need to play golf on his own properties to promote his own interests, as opposed to going somewhere else that's more secure. You know, to totally close this river, you're going to have people floating along in inner tubes drinking beer, coming up against security, and then they have to get miles down the river to their pickup point, and I guess they're going to be sitting there drinking beer while someone plays 18 holes of golf, the president or other undesignated important individuals. So this is something that's going to require some pushback, I think, with the Secret Service, where the Coast Guard says this is not practical for this sort of recreational activity. You could post a Zodiac there with a machine gun, and if you see a threatening paddleboarder, take them out. You know, that might solve the problem. So I will be asking questions about that also. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Admiral, again, thank you for being here and for your long service, and you're now recognized.
Chairman, thank you, and Ranking Member Garamendi, Ranking Member DeFazio, and members of this committee staff, thank you for giving me this opportunity to testify today. I do ask that my written statement be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Okay, as this committee well knows, the Coast Guard is a longstanding member of the armed services. We've served in every military campaign dating back to 1790. Today, there are over 20 Coast Guard cutters committed to supporting DoD's global operations, chopped to DoD. And on any given day, there are 5 aircraft, 2 specialized boarding teams, and an all-reserve 130-member port security unit under the operational command of our DoD combatant commanders. I mention this to bring to your attention the Coast Guard's national security and defense missions are paramount. These are Coast Guard platforms and forces performing defense missions that are largely trained, equipped, maintained, and salaried as part of the Coast Guard's budget, not part of Department of Defense. Yet as a military service, only 4% of my budget is funded through defense discretionary appropriations. The other 96, I must compete with every other federal discretionary account to fully fund a broad array of missions that span the globe and have not diminished over time. For the past 5 years, our annualized appropriations for operations and maintenance has been below the Budget Control Act floor, as the other armed services lament the prospect of being funded at the BCA water level. The Coast Guard finds itself underwater in that regard. Our 11 statutory missions, they best align with those of the Department of Homeland Security. And 2 of our highest priority regions, reining in transnational criminal organizations like never before across the Western Hemisphere, Central and South America before they reach the United States, and exerting sovereignty while protecting safety of life at sea in the Arctic, do not rank high in the regionalized national military strategy. So yes, we are moored in the proper home port in the Department of Homeland Security and simply require the right funding mechanism befitting a military service. So going forward, the Coast Guard requires 5% annualized growth in its operations and maintenance account and a $2 billion floor in our acquisition account. This would allow me to dig out of the Budget Control Act basement, sustain current operations, and grow our workforce, while concurrently building out our fleet of national security cutters, offshore patrol cutters, fast response cutters, icebreakers, inland construction tenders, reduce our shore infrastructure backlog of $1.6 billion, missionized C-27J aircraft, and advanced land-based unmanned aerial systems, and make that a program of record. Now, I regret the less than timely, and all you've seen is a chart of our 5-year capital investment plan. We continue to be in negotiation on late receipt of a budget as we move forward in a service that has lived through 16 continuing resolutions over the last 7 years, and 2 funding lapses and 40% swings in what our annualized capitalization investment is going to be year to year. Our unfunded priority list, that reflects reality. And what it shows is a 40% gap in our 5-year capital investment plan and what we need to be a Coast Guard of the 21st century. Now, rest assured, I will continue to work with our department, with this administration, and with members of Congress to close these gaps going into the future. And what you need, and I fully understand, is our 20-year SIP. As a military service, we are the only military service that can say we have a clean financial audit opinion. We've done that now for 4 consecutive years. We're delivering ships on time, on budget, with 0 growth and with 0 deficiencies, and these ships pay for themselves in value of contraband removed on their maiden deployment. And these ships will be in service for more than 3 decades to come. It is a great investment. And I appreciate the investment that this committee has made to our United States Coast Guard. That makes this the world's best Coast Guard, bar none. And looking out for the welfare of our people and our blended retirement system to ensure that we do not sacrifice our retirements, our benefits, and to make sure that we have a permanent solution to this legislative mandate that addresses blended retirement. So on behalf of all 88,000 men and women who serve our Coast Guard, thank you for serving us. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Commandant. Just because we're so happy to have people here, I'm going to yield to Mr. Lewis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Admiral, for appearing here today and for your service. We obviously honor that and appreciate it. I just have one quick question, and I brought it up at the last, one of the last hearings anyway, and that was about the need to keep open our shipping lanes in the Great Lakes in the harsh winters. I come from the great state of Minnesota, and it is vital in Duluth and throughout the country. So I'm wondering, there's a lot of attention on the polar icebreakers, but I'm wondering, trying to cover the cost of delays and millions of dollars of commercial revenue when we've got severe ice coverage on the Great Lakes, what the Coast Guard, or where we are in the procurement of a couple of much-needed Great Lakes icebreakers right now.
I thank you for that question. So, current state, we are extending the service life of our 140-foot ice-breaking tugs who have performed yeoman duty up in the Great Lakes. We've had an advantage of a very light ice season, so we're not putting wear and tear on any of these assets. And we've also entered into an agreement with our Canadian counterparts several years ago to assure that we have some agreement between the two if we have severe ice seasons like you saw in 2014 and in 15, that we can apply those scarce resources to the best advantage. As you have seen, that there is a line item in our 2017 budget that addresses design and construction of a Great Lakes icebreaker. If I were to rank that on all my priorities right now, my biggest priority in my icebreaking fleet is going to be our heavy icebreaker, which is consuming not just bandwidth, but also a significant portion of our budget as well.
No, and I understand that. I understand the national security implications of the polar icebreakers and getting all of that done. But I am obviously concerned. I think there's the Mackinac, one icebreaker in the Great Lakes. Is that correct?
That is correct, Congressman.
And so we're extending the service life of the 140-foot icebreakers. Do I have any idea how long that extension is, or what the life expectancy is?
Yeah, we plan to get 10 more years out of those vessels.
10 more years. I'm just wondering at what point. I mean, you mentioned. And I certainly share in your concerns how the Guard has been shortchanged in a number of areas with regard to the BCA levels or just getting 4% of DOD appropriations and things like that. But I do think this is a very important part of your mission, obviously, with regard to commerce in the Great Lakes. And I would just call your attention to that, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. The ranking member of the full committee is recognized. Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, you did state in your testimony about the need for $2 billion to begin to catch up, and I understand the pressures the service has been under, and I'm always endeavored to support additional funding. But even in this 5-year outline you provided us, you don't any one of those years hit the $2 billion. I mean, it looks like roughly 800, 600, 400. 200, 300 million short. So that totals up to, well over like $1.4 billion or something like that. So how does this reflect being able to catch up on the $2 billion a year?
Congressman, I'm glad you brought that up because
Yeah.
what that does reflect is fiscal guidance. And we are a service that has lived within fiscal guidance, and fiscal guidance is not getting the mission done for us. So the 5-year, those numbers that you see that don't approach $2 billion, those are the constraints of living within fiscal guidance.
Okay,
On
meaning
the
you're
priorities.
being dictated to in terms of what you can ask for.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And whoever is dictating that you come up with numbers that are not adequate. Just like the record to reflect that. A quick question about the icebreakers. There was one report recently that, you know, if we bought a group standardized design, 4 or 5, we could get the price down after the first one. And then there was a question about militarization. And I guess my question would be, and I don't know if you're the appropriate person, but it seems to me that, you know, I could envision a point at which, I mean, the Navy is not going to be able to get assets up into what is basically going to become a seasonal shipping lane and an area of potential conflict between ourselves and the Russians, given the extraordinary claims they're making in the Arctic. And, you know, maybe the Navy should be paying for these icebreakers, and you guys operate them. What do you think?
Well, we already have an integrated program office stood up with the Navy and $150 million in the Navy shipbuilding account. That builds 20% of an icebreaker. I would like to see 100% of the first icebreaker, then look at block buy. And at that point, I'm agnostic in terms of source of funding. Does it support Homeland Security? Does it support defense? Does it support the United States of America? And most importantly, it answers that question. We have unique sovereign interests that other nations are encroaching upon. As you mentioned, Russia is claiming all the way up to the North Pole.
Right.
We're just sitting there watching that happen. We need a means to exercise our sovereignty in these high latitudes, and we are severely lacking in that. We will need that legislative approval to do block buys, but beyond this first icebreaker, we need to look at a block buy of icebreakers and accelerate the build-out of this program.
Okay, excellent, thank you. On to the issue of the security on the Potomac. Have there been or could there be discussions with the Secret Service regarding something less than a bank-to-bank, you know, total closure over a couple of mile section of the river?
I happened to fly over that very same stretch of river late yesterday afternoon, over the golf course. As you mentioned, there's no foliage, so it is clearly exposed from the riverfront up to the clubhouse. We're working with the 3 canoe groups, the kayak groups, to allow them passage on the Maryland side of the Potomac River, and then once you get beyond that, you enter Class 1 rapids, which you will not take an inner tube down. So we're looking at striking a balance between the two. So as you have brought up, and Ranking Member Garamendi as well have elevated this issue, we listened and we are making that accommodation to the public.
Okay, for just the organized groups, or would that include individual canoeists? I mean,
So we've met with the American Canoe Association, with the groups that haul out there, and as long as they stay to the Maryland side of the Potomac River, they can pass clearly when the security zone is in effect.
okay, I hadn't seen that notice or that change in the notice, so that's welcome news. And would that accommodate the kids in the camp too?
It would.
Okay, that's very good news then. Okay, thank you. I'll look forward to seeing. Now, is that a final disposition because you had a pending rule? Is that?
Well, I read your letters.
Yeah.
And rather than read it, I had to see it.
Okay.
And meeting with our staff, the sector commander, we can make an accommodation here.
Okay, excellent. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the ranking member of the full committee. I now recognize myself. We'll just start rolling here, Commandant. The UPL that went to OMB, then finally got to us, didn't include 6 FRCs for CENTCOM. How big of a priority was that for the Coast Guard?
When the executive order came out on restoring readiness for our military, as soon as that was released, I sent a memo to the Department of Defense, to the chairman, to the Secretary of Defense, and said we're going to need to recapitalize these 6 patrol boats that are serving in the Northern Arabian Gulf. I've I've also met with the CENTCOM commander as well. There is an enduring requirement to do so, but to use DoD funding to be able to build those out. So the reason that does not appear in our unfunded priority list, that could be funded by overseas contingency operations or some other mechanism, because that will have an exclusive and sole purpose DoD mission to support.
Do you think DOD is going to spring for that then?
I'm hopeful that they will.
Do you have a timeline?
I do not, so they're looking at how long can these 110-foot cutters remain in service. We've only got about maybe 5 years. The good news is we have a hot product line for these fast response cutters, and we're turning these out. As I mentioned, the last 5 came out with no discrepancies, so we can turn out service-ready platforms.
So theoretically, you would just tack on these 6 to the hotline at some point and get them over there?
Correct.
Recapitalize. Got it. Thank you. I guess we can go to the timing, and this kind of falls into the overarching question of the relation between the shortfall of the acquisition, construction, and improvements, and the planning for that, and your mission capability, because that's what we're looking at, right? We're saying it in dollars, about $200 million short at the best, and then lower than that, much more short. The gap's bigger going through. Here's a nice slide. The red line is what we've authorized. The blue line is what's been appropriated, and the green line is what the Coast Guard's budget request has been. Of just above the red line, say an inch, is where your program of record, all your programs of record, let's call them a program of record, that's where those hit, is just above the red line. So your requests never come close. That big spike is, I think, national security cutter, right? And then after that, even the appropriated dollars go down until you get another NSC, but those never meet. And that's expressed in dollars, but what I'd like you to do right now is talk about it in terms of capability.
So what you're looking at is, life below the floor of the Budget Control Act. When we deal with our fiscal planning guidance, it typically comes in at or below the floor already. And then with each iteration over the last several years, we've been asked to then identify a 5% excursion in addition to a funding level that's already funded below the BCA floor, which is why I'm looking at a 5% annualized growth in this account to dig out of what is literally a basement, and we've been handed a shovel. So where does that pain get felt? Well, we start deferring maintenance. You defer maintenance, you go down a slippery slope. We have 72-year-old inland construction tenders in service today that enable $4.6 trillion of commerce to take place. And we never stepped out and said, well, what are we going to do about investing these? So part of it, I bear the responsibility of. We've been a service that will only build one thing at a time, a national security cutter. When we finish that, we'll move on to the next. Well, there's 5 classes of ships that we need to recapitalize today, and not just the ships, but also the outgoing maintenance to maintain these ships as well, because too often we just look at the initial acquisition cost and not the out-year expenses for training, for people, for maintenance. And that's where you start running into a train wreck, is when you start deferring maintenance or you start cutting force structure. And that green line has taken us to a place where we cannot continue to navigate into the future.
Okay, but your 20-year plan, which we don't have, I would guess that would lay those things out.
It will.
Right? That would, I mean, that's where you would get that information from. So have you submitted the 20-year plan?
We have not, and I owe that to you.
So it has not even been submitted to the department at all?
It has not.
Okay. I guess following up with that, and I think we've asked you this every time you've been in front of this subcommittee, why do you think that discrepancy is there? You think it's because DOD doesn't have this problem. DOD is able to they're strong enough they can tell OMB to go pound sand. You say you're a defense service, a military service, yet your 11 statutory missions fall in line with Homeland Security, but Homeland Security is not funding you appropriately. So is it a question of Coast Guard willpower, like the will to get this done, brain power? What's the problem, do you think?
Part of it is just the categorization of our appropriation, non-defense discretionary. And so 96% of that, we compete with all other federal non-discretionary funding. And there are lots of non-discretionary funding needs. I don't take that away from anybody. But as a military service, I am competing for every other aspect, and yet only 4% of our funding comes from a defense appropriation. A recategorization of that would allow me to compete better. But when I get fiscal planning guidance, which is focused on that 96%, and then how do we divvy up non-defense discretionary, that's how you end up with green lines. That's how you end up with, well, we need to take a 5% excursion below the BCA floor because we need even more non-defense discretionary. The Coast Guard will never bail out our nation's debt, which is going to approach $830 billion in the year 2026. My budget is under $11 billion. The Coast Guard is not going to pay us out. But we are a great investment, and what we have not done adequately enough is play offense and this defensive back and forth of how do we build out a budget in the out years. We need to state our needs.
But when you're in Homeland Security and you are, let's say, tightly held to that planning, to that financial guidance, how do you expect to break out of this?
I'm seeing very positive signs. We saw that during a passback that went public, the Coast Guard would have seen a 13% reduction to its budget. Our Secretary Kelly, went to the highest places to ensure that the Coast Guard was fully funded for 2017, and we are. But we have tremendous support, and we did from Secretary Johnson as well, but the access that this Secretary has to key leadership within this government who understands the United States Coast Guard, who understands the military, we have very good alignment with senior leadership today.
Do you think that your financial guidance is going to change?
I do.
Be towards that red line?
I do, Chairman, and I will work to make sure that happens.
When do you think that we'll see that reflected?
I want to see that happen in 18, 19, and again, I want to see, I'm serious about this 5% annualized growth, $2 billion, and people say, well, you're asking for too much. The fact that we can account for our dollars, the fact that we have almost no growth at all in our acquisition budget, and again, when the Coast Guard cutter Stratton or the Hamilton returns from its maiden voyage with $1 billion of cocaine on it.
If we could sell that cocaine, we could close some of your
We're not there yet, but where transnational
California's going to legalize coke.
organizations are,
in years.
where they're most vulnerable really is when they're on the water. And their biggest dread is when they see a national security cutter launching a ship-based unmanned aerial system. They don't even know they're out there till we find them. And then that armed helicopter arrives overhead. And if they try to run away, we stop them. 585 smugglers brought to the United States for prosecution, 100% of them prosecuted here in the United States. I think that's a successful mission.
Okay. Hey, last thing, I'm going to pass it on to Ranking Member Garamendi. We had a debate, not quite a debate, we just did the National Defense Authorization Act, and we talked about icebreakers, and we talked about the fund. I think we lost that amendment, right? The Chairman Thornberry voted against the amendment to allow icebreaker money to go into their account in the Navy. And what I got from that is that the political leadership here and the Department of Defense and the Navy, none of them see icebreakers as a national security asset. That's what I took away from it. Why is that? You think that's correct? You think it's more of a saving lives when we start drilling for oil and going after natural resources in the Arctic? Or do you think there is a national security mission, not a search and rescue, break boats out of ice mission?
Let me answer it this way, Chairman. We have an area the size of the state of Texas that is part of our extended continental shelf. And nearly half of the oil and gas reserves are below that seafloor in our 200-mile limit and our extended continental shelf. China has an icebreaker on its way right now, and they will do scientific research in this extended continental shelf. And maybe someday we ratify the Law of the Sea Convention, and we claim what is rightfully ours. China will contest that. And so we have sovereign interests that are up there. Russia will take delivery of 2 ice-breaking corvettes with cruise missiles on them. They're militarizing search and rescue stations. And doesn't this look like a movie we've seen in the East and South China Sea? It's known as area access denial, and we have no means to exert sovereignty. So what do you need an icebreaker to do, not just today, but 30 years from now? Reserve space, weight, and power because you might have to weaponize this icebreaker. It's great we have submarines, but I think it's very difficult to exert sovereignty with a submarine. You have one course of action, and that's to sink an adversary.
Well, tell me,
What do you use?
what is the disconnect then?
So the
Because
disconnect
what you're
is,
saying makes sense to us, but no one else is buying it, and that was made clear last week.
well, I think you answered the question. Buying it. Buying it.
Money.
This is an issue of national security.
This is one of those things that everybody says we need, but nobody wants to put the money in.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you very much. Ranking Member Garamendi, you're recognized.
Your opening statement, you said that the Coast Guard provides Department of Defense services. You mentioned 20 cutters, you mentioned aircraft. What is the total cost of the services that you are currently providing for national defense purposes, worldwide?
Yeah, Congressman, I'll break that out and provide you what that breaks out to. And that includes salaries, maintenance. It's a pretty significant number when you add it all up. It's not just the cost of burning fuel doing a mission.
Yeah, I would appreciate that information. When we took this issue up on the floor with an amendment that I proposed last week, the chairman, I think it was the chairman of the Appropriation Committee, spoke on the floor and said that the Coast Guard does not provide any national defense services. In answer to the question that the chairman just posed to you, the problem is ignorance amongst us. And so we have to deal with that. And if you can provide us with the information about the actual cost of the services and all of the equipment, airplanes, cutters, et cetera, it would be helpful in providing a little level of knowledge to key people here within this department. Also, we might send that information to the Office of Management and Budget, where I think I heard you say, no, you didn't accuse them of the problem, but you did say you were given instructions. And so this sheet of information that you gave us is really a result of the Office of Management and Budget telling you what you must tell us. Don't respond. I don't want you to get in trouble. However, I do note that the Office of Management and Budget is willing to spend $1.6 billion on a 40 to 70 mile extension of existing walls or repair of existing walls on the Mexican border. What could you do with $1.6 billion to really protect the United States from immigrants, drug smugglers, and the like on the southern border?
If you allow me firsthand, where I've been in the last month, meeting with presidents in Colombia and the vice president of Ecuador, the president of Panama, and heads of state in Mexico City. When I was in Ecuador, they have violent crime and they have drug usage because of the rampant growth of cocaine coming out of the country of Colombia. Colombia is besieged with the amount of coca under development. Mexico is seeing at their front at the far end of this, but everyone is saying we need more United States Coast Guard off our coast. And as successful as we are, it really comes down to sheer numbers. We don't have enough planes in the air to include unmanned aerial systems, enough ships on the ocean to leverage all of the information. We have an awareness of over 80% of the drug flow that's ultimately destined for our nation. It doesn't land, it lands 1,500 miles south of the border. It lands in bulk in 80-pound bales of cocaine. And when it lands, law enforcement will turn their head the other way because if they don't, they'll be killed. Rule of law goes out the window. That's why we're seeing violent crime. With that violent crime, which is why you're seeing families putting their children in the hands of human smugglers to get them to the United States. The irony is the United States demand is driving this train. And yet they want to get their children here in the United States. But to stop this where this threat is most vulnerable is actually at sea, where this law enforcement agency will not turn its back. We will seize you, and we will prosecute you. That, to me, is a key instrument of regional stability right here in our backyard where we see some of the worst violent crime in the world is right here just to the south and well south of our border with our trade partner, Mexico.
You gave a very good description of what you're doing. What could you do with $1.6 billion? These are our choices. We, the representatives of the American people, are making a choice to spend $1.6 billion on a wall, or on some 40, maybe 70 miles of wall, instead of spending that money on the U.S. Coast Guard or on any other thing. And my question is, if you had $1.6 billion, it's going to be spent the next year. It's going to be spent in 2018, budget year, $1.6 billion. Now, we could make the choice to give $1.6 billion of additional money to the Coast Guard. You could build 3 icebreakers over the next 3 years, 4 years, with $1.6 billion. Is that correct? About 700, well, 2.5.
Yeah, but once we award a contract, do a block buy, and then it's a delivery schedule. We build out not 4, but 6 fast response cutters each year. We accelerate the build out of the offshore patrol cutter, because these are the assets, especially our fast response cutters, offshore patrol cutters, that we can bring and swing into this part of the world.
And for icebreakers, if you had a block buy, there's 700 to 800 billion, a million apiece, 700 to 800 million apiece. I think that's the current estimate.
That's a ballpark figure.
So 2.5, not 3. These are choices. These are choices that we're making. I listened last night to the, sitting there listening for hours to the Rules Committee debating what to do with this $1.6 billion for a wall. I just bring this to the attention of all of us here. Currently, the plan is 3 heavies and 3 light to deal with the issues, icebreakers, going forward. They're not in your budget. They're not in your 5-year capital investment, acquisition, construction, improvement budget, nor are any of the onshore facilities that are in the document that you gave us of unfunded priorities. Incidentally, I don't see in this document either the 2 additional heavies or the 2 or the 3 lights. Is that an unfunded priority that's not listed here?
What you're seeing is just our near-term unfunded priority list.
Okay.
That doesn't take us out into a 20-year SIP.
I noticed that your your total budget is somewhere around $10 billion a year, maybe 11 if we add in
10.7,
the
salaries, retirement, that's everything.
I'm going to just speak to the chairman here for a moment. There are 2 of us on this committee that are also on the Armed Services Committee. And over the last week, I know you and I have been trying to leverage into the Department of Defense's $700 billion budget, another billion or so for the Coast Guard, particularly for the icebreakers. We've been unsuccessful in doing that. And I think we ought to continue to try to do that. I do not have an explanation for the question you raised, Mr. Chairman, about why the U.S. Navy wants to build 350 or have 355 ships and not be able to use any of those ships except for submarines in the Arctic Ocean. It makes no sense to me at all. They want to build more LCSs, which are, by their own estimate, useless in a conflicted environment, but yet they want 3 more of those, which those 3 could fund 2 of the icebreakers. I don't understand. I don't understand what the U.S. Navy is thinking here, nor do I understand what my colleagues on the House Armed Services Committee are thinking about continuing to build ships that are useless in the Arctic, and we know the Arctic is a contested environment today and will be more so in the future. So I guess I'm just speaking, I don't know, maybe to myself here. But I want the public to know that there's a serious error being made by the House Armed Services Committee and specifically by the subcommittee dealing with sea power, in that they are building ships that are not capable in a contested environment, LCSs, that do not perform even the services in an uncontested environment for which they were designed. At the same time, unwilling to provide the U.S. Coast Guard, which is a defense organization, as well as a civilian organization, with the money it needs not only for Icebreakers, but to provide the men, equipment necessary for the existing Department of Defense services that they're doing. So maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but I want it on the record that we are making some serious errors, and we've got to correct these errors. With that, I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. I think the Coast Guard actually built the best LCS. It's called the NSC. That's what the Navy needs to get on board with. The former chairman of the committee, whose portrait sits behind you, Commandant, is now recognized. Mr. Young.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And let me introduce his wife, Ann, is back there, too. Welcome, Ann.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. And, you know, someone once told me you always pay for the sins that you have sown. And I look at my portrait every day, and I think I'm paying for my sins right now. But, Admiral, welcome. We appreciate it. How old are you?
62.
Okay, let's see, 62. You were 14 years old approximately when I got elected. So congratulations on your climb to success.
That makes you a ranking member.
Yeah, thank you. You know, we hear a lot about, and I listen to the minority leader, vice chairman of the committee, and I appreciate what he's saying. We're actually concentrating on icebreakers or breakers in the Arctic, and I know we need those, but that's not a defensive weapon. And I look at the border of Alaska, and especially in the Arctic, and with the activity of Russia and China, it's a worrisome type time. China's building icebreakers, which I don't understand, and so of course, you know, Russia's got a whole lot more being built. Have you looked at, Admiral, I know this has been an ongoing battle with me and the Coast Guard over the years, the other possibility of getting an icebreaker into the arena quicker than having one constructed, like leasing from another outfit. You know, I've been talking about this a long time. Have you analyzed this again? I know the last time we had a study was 1980. That's a long time ago. So is there a way we can put metal on the water, especially for the new shipping through and the cruise ships, because that Healy is old. And have you looked at that at all?
We have, in fact, one potential vendor. We've had multiple interactions. They have a platform that has yet to complete ice trials. We would not want to lease something that can't demonstrate its ability to actually operate in the ice that Healy sees. Healy was actually beset in ice for 36 hours last year, so it's not ice-free up there, and that's a medium icebreaker. This particular platform doesn't have the capability of Healy, but we would at least want to make sure that ice trials were completed, that we could actually be a good steward of taxpayer dollars to lease a platform that would meet our requirements. So we've had multiple interactions. The last one was probably in May, and the issue of ice trials is still on the table right now.
The vessel itself that you're talking about, and I happen to agree with you, if it doesn't do the job, you don't want to lease it. But, you know, we could probably lease a vessel for a whole lot more for a short period of time than because I don't have confidence we're going to get the money to build the icebreaker you need. For some reason, the Arctic is still not on the forefront of everybody's mind right now. Is health bill and tax bill and transportation bill. Where's Mr. Schuster? You know, all those things, but they're not thinking about what you need. And we keep adding on to you, and it's like the chairman has said, we're not properly funding you, and that concerns me, and I just want you to know that. I think the last icebreakers were built by Lockheed, and they're no longer in operation. Is there a capability with the ship industry to build a good icebreaker?
I'm very confident there is, Congressman. There are 5 shipyards that we've awarded industry studies to. They've done mock-ups of ice trials, and they are actually ahead of the power curve, so to say, in terms of their ability to submit a request for proposal where we could honor and start cutting steel. What I have in front of me, this is about the weight of a gold brick. That is a piece of steel out of the Coast Guard cutter Polar Star. We have not built ships like this since Lockheed Martin built the Polar Sea and Polar Star. They are very confident we can build these here in the United States, built in the U.S.
Well,
with U.S. workers.
They will be built in the United States, that I'll guarantee you.
Yes, sir.
I'm not going to bet any hand foreign ship deal. Now back to parochial activity. As you know, I like your fast cutters or fast response cutters. I happen to be privileged to be on one when it first made its maiden voyage. Great ship. But I'm a little concerned parochially about one-on-one docking, porting, because it looks like now you're going to have 2 in Ketchikan, 1 in Sitka. Petersburg's been left out, but they had a tender there. As we build the next ones, we're building, I think you're building 6 more?
Yeah, 6 will be home ported in Alaska. Sitka, as you mentioned, Seward, Kodiak are other ports of consideration in addition to where we have 2 in Ketchikan right now.
But I'm interested because if you look at Alaska, come to my office, look at that map, that's a hell of a coast. And we do have problems. You know, I was listening to your testimony on the drug problem. You know, did you apprehend or, you know, get everything done, and you say they're prosecuted, but how's the prosecution going? Are we doing anything about it or after you catch them?
We're doing phenomenally well here in the United States. 100% prosecution. If they're prosecuted downrange, maybe 5%. So extradition, prosecution in the United States. And these aren't wrist slaps. These are 10, 12, 15-year sentences. They might be able to bargain down if they're providing us valuable information about where this activity is leaving. So when we talk about organized crime, it becomes disorganized once they face prosecution.
Yeah. Well, I know I shouldn't say this, Mr. Chairman, but I had a bill I've written up that's pretty good. It's called D&D bill. You dealing, you're dead. The demand is huge in the United States. I don't understand that, but the dealers just absolutely are committing murder. And prosecution is great, 10 years, 5 years, that doesn't mean anything. If you knew that you were going to be hanging from the yard line, you might think a little differently. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Admiral, congratulations again. Good job.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your many years of service.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Mr. Lowenthal is recognized. By the way, we almost had an all-California
What's that?
up here.
And Alaska.
Don messed it up.
Honorary Californian.
I'm from California. I learned something.
Good morning, Admiral. Cybersecurity, I'm going to focus a little bit on cybersecurity.
Yeah,
And first,
I
thank the
guess I can get up.
Coast Guard for really helping our Ports Caucus
Oh, yeah, well,
when we, in our latest discussions about cybersecurity, and I'll ask about that. It's both a critical part and component of our homeland security and also security for our transportation network. You know, and we all know that an attack upon our critical or crucial infrastructure, such as the ports, can have a tremendous impact on goods movement and, in turn, the entire U.S. economy. So the first question is, what is the Coast Guard doing to keep our ports safe from cyber attack and to also safeguard our critical maritime infrastructure? And then the second question is, and I want to, again, thank you for your help, what did the Coast Guard learn? What lessons have we learned from the recent attack against Maersk, which, as we saw, closed down a number of their terminals, throughout the APM terminals throughout the nation? So kind of what are you doing and what have we learned now, using this as a learning experience?
Great question, Congressman. So for more than 14 years now, we have had area maritime security committees in 37 of our major ports where we have a captain of the port. Let me take LA Long Beach as an example. They also have cyber subcommittees on these area maritime security committees. Now, when the committees were first stood up, there were security measures that were put into place: fencing, cameras, lighting, transportation worker identification credential, and the like. Industry wasn't so pleased with some of these requirements, but it was written into law. Now we're dealing with a whole new threat called cyber. We are working with the National Institute of Standards of Technology. We'll actually put out voluntary guidelines to all of industry, but I use LA Long Beach as a great case study. I was out at Long Beach container terminals last year, and they have nearly fully automated that container terminal. drayage trucks that are moved autonomously. They use batteries. They don't burn fossil fuel.
We're talking about Long Beach Container Terminal.
Yes, sir.
Right now.
So now we have an event with Maersk Terminals. In fact, I will be in LA on Friday of this week, and I'm going to meet with Maersk to say, what did they learn from this? What they immediately did was they shut down most of their operations. This particular piece of malware erases all of your data. So they took mostly precautionary measures by doing a shutdown before their data would have been erased, and then to make sure that they can bring those systems back online. What it does indicate is the lack of resiliency in our entire maritime transportation system. If you look at all of maritime shipping, and if there's a cyber event that brings that down. As you well know, off the coast of California, this is just-in-time inventory, and $1 billion plus of commerce goes through the ports of LA, Long Beach each and every day. And it doesn't stop there. It goes on a rail system. It goes through the Rust Belt, and it goes to New York, and it goes on to Antwerp from there. So any disruption along that supply chain has a global consequence, and what that did elevate is we can't take our eye off the maritime domain. Maersk is doing a great job. Sometimes you're beholden to a subcontractor, someone else that has access to your data. They provide a backdoor into your systems. And so that's the vulnerability that we need to look at closing as we start looking at what is cybersecurity. And the other challenge is how do we hold those accountable who would actually try to disrupt our supply chains? Because this is really an attack on our national security at the end of the day.
Did you learn anything that you might change some of our procedures or interactions with other agencies? Out of this, what did we learn? What did the Coast Guard learn in terms of how effective they were in responding to this and having responses, coordinated responses from all the potential agencies that are impacted by a cyber attack?
Yeah, well, the first thing we learned, Congressman, is that we don't have the cyber cavalry, if you will, a cyber protection team that can go out and immediately apply patches to allow an industry to recover from a cyber attack. What we also learned, though, is Maersk reported. And sometimes there are disincentives to reporting that your systems may have been compromised because obviously, you know,
Right.
in the private sector that could have secondary consequences. But the fact they were forthcoming so we could look across the entire cyber domain within the maritime transportation system and ascertain that this was the only one that had been singled out across all the maritime stakeholders, but allowed us to do a full sweep. Is this part of a concerted attack against multiple domains besides Maersk?
Well, I'm going to yield back. I want to thank you. I mean, I see this as the critical issue moving forward, is how we implement more cybersecurity, and that we understand just what we're up to, and that the industry, you know, this is a cooperative venture between the Coast Guard, private industry, our ports, and this could have a devastating impact upon the U.S. economy. And so I'm just really pleased that you're on it and that you're working on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're gonna wrap up here. Mr. Garrett and I have a couple of last quick questions, and we'll go to the second panel, Admiral. Back to the icebreakers really quick. And the next panel, you're going to have the Assistant Commandant for Acquisitions on that one, Admiral Haycock. You'll probably answer some of these, but Ron O'Rourke can probably answer a couple of these too. But just what is your take on why you don't want to block by the first-in-class heavy? Why not start, if you have the design done, and I'm sure with the oversight and the attention that the icebreakers are going to get, everybody's going to make sure that the design is totally done, that lead materials are purchased, that it goes along in that fashion, right? So it's not haphazard. Why not block the first ships?
What we've seen just in our first ship buys is that there's a learning curve, and obviously with a heavy icebreaker, a very steep learning curve. We haven't built a ship of this design in 4 decades. So there is inherent risk doing a block buy, where industry may want to, shed some of that risk. And if we do a block buy of maybe $950 million per copy, well, maybe that second ship we can negotiate down into a more affordable range, and then recognizing second, third, fourth, and so on. Those ships, you can then get into a more affordable range than we might with a lead ship, if we're really trying to get all of our requirements met, but do so at an affordable range.
So if things go perfectly, when do you think we'd start building the first icebreaker, the first heavy?
We want to award not later than 2019 and have it in the water by 2023, have ice trials done, and if it meets all those requirements, that's the time to lock in a block buy.
So how does that match up then with the 3 heavies and 3 mediums?
Well, you've probably seen the National Academy of Sciences that said, 4 heavies.
Also on the next panel.
on the
Their
next
stuff said that you could build a 4th heavy for cheaper, for less money than you could build your first-in-class medium.
I agree with that, the science that comes behind that. Lead ships are typically more expensive. Second ships, you realize some economies of scale. But certainly a 4th heavy would probably come in less expensive than a first medium icebreaker. And it can operate around the globe.
But right now, it's pie in the sky, really, talking about 2, 3, 4.
It informs another study. So we have the high latitude that said 3 heavy, 3 medium, and why 6? Well, have you seen, whether you're a carrier strike group, but it usually takes 3 ships to have full-time presence in any given region. One that's there, one that's coming back and will go through a refit, and the other one that's working up and getting ready to go. So that's how you end up with a number of 6. Now that number 4 that the National Academy of Science released, those are all 4 heavy icebreakers, but it also includes the Healy.
Right.
So it leaves you with 5. So we're still looking at what is the right number. The right number right now is 1, and get that first one built, do the block buy, and start building out this program of record.
Going back to Mr. Young's question, too, about leasing, you said you're waiting for, I'm guessing, money for ice trials? That's what you said?
No real dollars have been negotiated in any of this. So.
But in real terms, though, you're only paying for gas. I mean, what does it cost to do ice trials? It's gas, right? You're not going to hire more Coast Guardsmen to come in and do it. I mean, so that's a figure, your overhead's fixed. So what does it cost to go do ice trials with the IVIC?
That would really be for the
IVIC, once again, the only
vendor to
existing U.S.-made icebreaker in America.
Yeah. So this is a ship that is built with direct drive diesel. Icebreakers are typically diesel electric, which means the generators push the shaft, and they absorb that shock load every time you collide with ice. A reduction gear, fixed gear, is going to, that gearbox is going to absorb all that shock. So if you're going to do ice trials, there's a likelihood you might have to replace a reduction gear. There might be real hidden costs in doing ice trials. So if I'm a vendor, I might want to protect myself from some of that risk. Now, I'm not the vendor, but those would be some of my thoughts of, okay, if you're really serious about this, and I do ice trials, and now I've just caused X number of dollars that I'm now going to have to fit, and oh, by the way, you're not going to lease it because it didn't meet your requirements. I think those are some of the issues that we still have to negotiate.
And lastly, for me, the continuation pay to put you with the other services. And again, this goes back to Homeland Security versus Department of Defense versus you as a military service versus you under Homeland Security with your 11 missions. We got creative. We were able to do a short-term fix. And if you could just talk a minute about the importance of that and how you plan on getting in line with the other services when it comes to retirement.
Yeah. Well, Chairman.
And just about everything else.
Yeah. Ranking Member Garamendi, your staff behind you, you guys did a lot of heavy lifting to get us through this first wicket. But we can't keep going through these wickets year in and year out. Maybe you don't clear a wicket one year because this is real money. This continuity pay, blended retirement was legislatively mandated. And yet this would immediately impact our retirement counts, my operation capability. It's a legislative change, but I just need the mechanism so we don't have to go back year in and year out, but a permanent solution. But I want to thank you for getting us through this first wicket, but there are many more in front of us.
It's kind of interesting. The blended retirement is probably more important, I would guess, for the other services. They probably have lower retention than the Coast Guard does. You have guys that get in for 10 years, do 8 tours, especially for Special Forces, then you get out and you get nothing. That's why we fix it on the Armed Services Committee. Probably different for the Coast Guard in terms of your retention and the burden on your service members too. I mean,
That's correct. So we enjoy the highest retention of any armed service today. I don't know what tomorrow holds in store for us, but certainly today, 40% of our recruits who leave basic training are on active duty 20 years later. 60% of our officers.
That's huge.
Which is a great return on investment.
Admiral, thank you very much for being here, and I'm going to Recognize Mr. Garamendi for closing remarks, sir.
Admiral, a couple of things. We've talked about icebreakers here. We'll go into icebreakers a little more with the second panel. I am concerned about where the National Academy of Science is going with regard to 4 icebreakers, 4 heavies, and basically putting aside the issue of the mediums. We'll deal with that in more detail, but just note my concern about that. Also, you and I have had this conversation. I want to get it on the record with regard to Buy America. The President talks about made in America. I want to talk about making it in America, which means that these icebreakers, as my goal is everything on that icebreaker is American-made. That may or may not be possible. I want to have a very, very tight window here for purchase of those parts of the icebreaker that are not American-made. I'd like to know your attitude on this and find out where you think this is going to go.
Well, that's a great point, and the frustration I have right now with some of our foreign-made parts, they go out of business. Or you find yourself waiting in line. That's holding up our ability to provide spare parts for the C-27J. Now, granted, we acquired these 14 aircraft. 13 are out there on the tarmac right now, but we're dependent upon a foreign supply chain to be able to outfit these to carry out national security missions. And so we need to look at the world around us, which is not exactly breaking out in tranquility. And do we want to be dependent upon a foreign source provider to equip our national assets? And so I am in lockstep with you, Congressman, that yes, these have got to be built in America so we don't find ourselves, we can't get the parts to keep these platforms running.
Good. The support necessary to build these icebreakers and any other thing really will come from the American economy or American manufacturers spread out across this nation participating in the construction of these icebreakers or any other pieces of equipment that you need. Just a couple of final comments then. I appreciate your testimony. In my opening, I was concerned about the information that we receive. I understand that you are told what to tell us. We do need to know what you need without being censored by the Office of Management and Budget. So my specific ask is that we get full information about what is required by the Coast Guard. I also ask for some information with regard to those portions of the Coast Guard operations that are clearly for national defense, Department of Defense. So if you'll get that to us as quick as possible, it would be helpful. We'll go forward. Admiral, thank you for your testimony.
Okay, thank you.
I yield back.
Admiral, thank you very much for being here. Thanks for your service.
Thank you.
It's good seeing you, and we'll get ready for the next panel.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Okay, thanks. Sorry I'll miss you on Saturday, but I'd love to just... The U.S. is oh, good. Good for them. Good for them. Yeah. Have fun out there. Okay. All right. Thanks for being here. Okay. No, thank you. Okay. Forthrightness. Okay. And again, thanks to Joe.
Yeah. Nicer man than me. It's good duty. All right. Ready to rock? All right, guys, let's do it. Good morning. On panel, we have saved the best for last, by the way. That's how it works. On panel 2, we will hear testimony from Rear Admiral Richard D. West, U.S. Navy retired, Chair of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Polar Icebreaker Assessment, Rear Admiral Michael J. Haycock, Assistant Commandant for Acquisition and Chief Acquisition Officer of the United States Coast Guard, Ms. Marie Mack, Director of Acquisition and Sourcing Management with the GAO, and Mr. Ronald O'Rourke, Specialist in Naval Affairs with the Congressional Research Service. With that, Admiral West, you're recognized to give your statement.
Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the recently released report, Acquisition and Operation of Polar Icebreakers, Fulfilling the Nation's Needs. I would like this report and my testimony to be entered into the record. My name is Dick West. I'm a retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral, and I chaired the study committee that authored the report for the National Academies. Our report was requested by this committee and focuses on strategies to minimize the capital acquisition and operating costs for polar icebreakers capable of meeting the Coast Guard's mission, including breakout of the McMurdo Station. For more than 30 years, studies have shown the need for polar icebreakers to fulfill the Coast Guard's statutory missions and to meet our national goals. These studies have indicated an ever-widening gap in the nation's ability to meet these statutory obligations, protect our interests, and maintain leadership in the high latitudes of our Earth. We recommend building 4 heavy polar icebreakers owned and operated by the Coast Guard and propose an acquisition strategy that could address these anticipated gaps. We examined leasing options and found them to be more expensive for the federal government over the life of the assets. The first 3 heavy icebreakers could meet the Coast Guard's requirements to provide a continuous presence in the Arctic, while the 4th heavy icebreaker could perform the annual McMurdo breakout. One of the 3 icebreakers assigned to the Arctic could also be emergency backup for the McMurdo's operation if it's required. The recommended acquisition strategy employs block buy contracting with a fixed price incentive fee for the 4 ships and a design for a single class of polar icebreakers. By using a single design, we estimate that the 4th heavy icebreaker would cost less than the first of a medium-class icebreaker. With our recommended strategy, icebreaker design and construction costs can be clearly defined. A fixed-price incentive fee construction contract is the most reliable mechanism for controlling costs for this program. Block buy authority for this program will need to contain specific authorizing language for economic order quantity purchases for materials, advanced design, and construction activities. Such a contracting program with economic order quantity purchases enables series construction, motivates competitive shipyard bidding, enables shipyard infrastructure investment, and reduces material acquisition costs, allowing for volume purchase and for timely acquisition of material long lead items. It would enable continuous production, give the program the maximum benefit from the learning curve, and thus reduce labor hours and costs on subsequent vessels. Technology transfer from icebreaker designers and builders with recent experience is critical for reducing design and construction costs. In addition, the design should maximize the use of commercial off-the-shelf equipment, apply the Polar Code and commercial standards, and reduce military specifications to the minimum necessary. Reduction of mil-spec requirements could significantly lower the acquisition cost of each ship with no loss of mission capability. Importantly, the program schedule must allow for completion of the design and planning before the start of construction. Our recommended acquisition, design, and construction strategies will control possible cost overruns and provide significant savings in the overall life cycles of the polar icebreaking program. We recommend that the single design for the heavy icebreakers be made science-ready and include sufficient space and margins to accommodate future installation of scientific equipment. The additional design cost is minimal, especially when it's compared to a subsequent retrofit for that vessel. Recognizing the Healy is halfway through its expected service life, the 4th proposed vessel could be made science-capable or fully outfitted for science. The Polar Star is well beyond her expected service life. We propose an enhanced maintenance program with the intent of keeping the vessel operational through the delivery of at least the first new icebreaker. Although extending the life of Polar Star will be challenging, the committee recommends against compressing the design and construction schedule of the new icebreakers, as such an approach may lead to cost overruns. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. Thank you again for the opportunity to reply, and I stand by to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. Admiral Haycock, you're recognized.
Thank you. I have written testimony I'd like to submit for the record and a short oral statement to read. Chairman Hunter,
Without
Ranking Member
objection.
Garamendi, members of the subcommittee, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about the Coast Guard's ongoing activities to recapitalize our surface, aviation, and command and control capabilities. Echoing the sentiments of the Commandant earlier this morning, I thank you for your oversight and your continued support of our service. I'm honored to represent 800 military and civilian personnel dedicated to delivering the assets and the capabilities to our operational community. 10 years ago this month, the Coast Guard stood up the Acquisition Directorate. In that time, the service has strengthened its acquisition management and its support functions, and has invested in recruiting, training, and retaining a highly qualified acquisition workforce. Today, we are seeing strong returns on that investment, and I'm proud to share with you an update on our efforts. First, I'd like to discuss the offshore patrol cutter, the Coast Guard's highest acquisition priority. This past year, we awarded a contract for detailed design and construction, which will enable us to build up to 9 offshore patrol cutters. We are on track to move forward with an order for long lead time materials for the first cutter before the end of the fiscal year. Regarding the heavy polar icebreaker, we're working closely with the Navy through an integrated program office to begin acquiring the nation's first heavy polar icebreakers in more than 40 years. We've adopted some of the Navy's best practices, including the use of industry studies. In fact, we awarded 5 industry study contracts in February to identify approaches that can further reduce acquisition costs and production timelines. We've also released a draft system specification for industry review, and we're developing a contract solicitation for design and construction of the lead heavy icebreaker. We're also continuing full-rate production on the National Security Cutter and our Fast Response Cutter classes, moving forward missionization and upgrades to our fixed-wing aviation fleet, and we're deploying enhanced command and control communication systems nationwide. The men and the women of the Coast Guard Acquisition Directorate have a lot to be proud of, and I'm committed to continuing the success that we've achieved since our stand-up 10 years ago. This means employing each and every tool and resource at my disposal to continue to deliver the best products to our operational commanders at the best price to the taxpayer. To that end, we are looking at contract authorities that are available or may be available, including multi-year procurement, that can help us take advantage of cost and schedule efficiencies and achieve greater affordability. The Coast Guard also recently received findings in the National Academy of Sciences Transportation Research Board's Polar Icebreaker Acquisition and Operations Study, and I plan to use its findings to inform our acquisition approach going forward. We greatly appreciate the valuable oversight function performed by this subcommittee and the robust independent assessments provided by Ms. Mack's team at the Government Accountability Office and Mr. O'Rourke and his team at the Congressional Research Service. Your role in Coast Guard acquisition success, both in the past and going forward, is a critical one, and we thank you for your support. The Commandant continues to make fleet recapitalization one of the service's highest priorities, and we're proud of the efforts to ensure our service stays true to its motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. Thank you for your support of the Coast Guard's effort to provide our men and women in uniform with the mission capability they need in the 21st century. I appreciate the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral. Ms. Mack, you're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here today to continue our discussion on GAO's body of work on the Coast Guard's recapitalization effort. We value the excellent working relations we have with the Coast Guard, and it is important for me to note that the Coast Guard, for the last few years, has been making progress in addressing GAO's concerns regarding its acquisition portfolio. However, as the Coast Guard moves forward in managing its multi-billion-dollar acquisition portfolio to modernize its aging and maintenance-intensive assets, the Coast Guard is facing several key acquisition planning challenges. The 2 areas that I would like to highlight today are, first, the importance of well-formulated planning tools for the Coast Guard to manage its overall affordability of its acquisition portfolio, and second, the acquisition risk related to the heavy polar icebreaker. With regard to planning tools, for the past several years, the Coast Guard has submitted to Congress its 5-year Capital Investment Plan, or CIP, intended to provide insight into the proposed budget for that particular fiscal year and the following 4 years. We found that the 5-year SIPs report the asset's total cost and schedule per the acquisition program baseline, however, does not account for trade-offs made in previous annual budget cycles. Furthermore, we have found that the projected funding levels far exceed the amount that the Coast Guard traditionally requests in its annual budget. In 2014, we recommended that the Coast Guard develop a 20-year fleet modernization plan, which is intended to identify all acquisitions necessary for maintaining at least its current level of service and the fiscal resources to build these assets. The Coast Guard reports that efforts are underway to develop this long-term plan, which the Coast Guard is calling a 20-year SIP. But to date, it is unclear when this plan will be completed and what level of detail it will contain. However, in line with the Office of Management and Budget's capital planning guidance, we would expect this 20-year SIP to include, among other things, a review of the portfolio of assets already owned by the Coast Guard and those that are in procurement, the capabilities necessary to bridge the old and new assets, and a justification for new acquisitions proposed for funding. The most recent unfunded priorities list that you referred to earlier is a good start at identifying more of the Coast Guard's needs that have been delayed, and we hope to see those and more in the 20-year plan. A long-term plan that also includes acquisition implications, such as sustainment costs, support infrastructure, and personnel needs, would further enable trade-offs to be identified and addressed prior to making irreversible commitments, and ensures that the maintainability of these assets. Second, while the Coast Guard has made progress in advancing the acquisition for 3 heavy polar icebreakers, the accelerated schedule it is pursuing poses risk. To meet this schedule, the Coast Guard is partnering with the Navy to leverage its expertise and reduce costs. This acquisition, according to Coast Guard officials, is considered one of its high-priority programs. However, such an acquisition would be difficult to afford while it builds the offshore patrol cutter, which would take anywhere from half to 2/3 of the Coast Guard's acquisition budget starting in 2018. If funds come primarily from Navy appropriations, as was being considered, additional risk concerns associated with the actual contracting process exist, with the Navy using the Department of Homeland Security's acquisition process. But as this committee mentioned earlier, if this is off the table, the Coast Guard's affordability concerns just multiplied significantly if funding stays where it historically has been the last several years. The Coast Guard faces some difficult and complex decisions with potentially significant cost and mission implications. Without completing this 20-year plan, the Coast Guard will continue, as it has in recent years, to plan its future acquisitions through the annual budgeting process, a process that has led to delayed capabilities. A comprehensive, long-term strategic plan would provide timely information to decision makers on how best to allocate resources in a constrained budget environment to build and maintain a modern, capable Coast Guard fleet. Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, members of the subcommittee, this completes my prepared statement. I would be pleased to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Mack. Mr. O'Rourke, good to see you. You're recognized.
Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss Coast Guard sea, air, and land capabilities. As requested, my testimony focuses on Coast Guard ship acquisition. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to submit my statement for the record and summarize it here briefly.
Without objection.
Coast Guard officials have begun stating regularly that executing their acquisition programs fully and on a timely basis will require an AC&I account of about $2 billion a year. Past Coast Guard statements have sometimes put the figure as high as $2.5 billion. That would represent a big increase over recently requested levels. It can be noted, however, that the requested funding levels for the Navy's shipbuilding account have increased by about $6.8 billion per year, or by about 50% during the period of the Budget Control Act. A common practice is to assume or predict that an agency's funding levels in coming years will likely be close to where they have been in previous years. For the Coast Guard, which goes through periods with less acquisition of major platforms, followed by periods with more acquisition of major platforms, this might not always be the best approach, at least for the AC&I account. Moreover, in relation to maintaining Congress's status as a co-equal branch of government An analysis that assumes or predicts that future funding levels will resemble past funding levels can encourage an artificially narrow view of congressional options regarding future funding levels, depriving Congress of agency in the exercise of its constitutional power to set funding levels and determine the composition of federal spending. The Navy in recent years has used multi-year procurement and block buy contracting to procure more than 2/3 of all the ships shown in the Navy's 5-year shipbuilding plans in recent years, saving billions of dollars in the process. In contrast, the Coast Guard has made zero use of multi-year contracting for its shipbuilding programs. Using multi-year contracting might reduce the OPC program's cost by about $1 billion, which is roughly the cost of a polar icebreaker or a 35-ship inland waterway tender program. This potential savings of $1 billion represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity for using multi-year contracting to reduce the cost of an individual Coast Guard acquisition program by such an amount. The Coast Guard currently is using a contract with options for acquiring the first 9 ships in the OPC program. A contract with options is not an example of multi-year contracting. Contracts with options operate more like annual contracting, and they don't achieve the savings that can be achieved through multi-year contracting. Acquiring the first 9 ships in the OPC program under the current contract with options could forego roughly $350 million of the $1 billion in potential savings. One option for the subcommittee would be to look into the possibility of having the Coast Guard replace the current OPC contract at an early juncture with a block buy contract. The planned OPC procurement rate of 2 ships per year would deliver OPCs many years after the end of the originally planned service lives of the existing medium endurance cutters. The Coast Guard has said it plans to extend the service lives of the medium endurance cutters to bridge the gap. A possible alternative would be to increase the OPC procurement rate to 3 or 4 ships per year, which could reduce their cost and accelerate the delivery of the 25th OPC by 4 to 6 years. There are various potential options for increasing its procurement rate to 3 or 4 per year. Using a block buy contract could reduce the cost of a 3-ship polar icebreaker procurement by upwards of $200 million. The savings on the 4-ship acquisition recommended in the National Academy's report would be greater, and the savings on a 5- or 6-ship procurement would be greater still and could exceed $400 million. And Mr. Chairman, you brought up the issue of whether the lead ship should be under that contract. I'll be happy to talk with you about that during the Q&A if you like. The Coast Guard has testified that the new inland waterway tenders might cost about $25 million each. Using that figure, a 35-unit replacement program might cost roughly $875 million. That cost, too, might be reduced through multi-year contracting. Numerous U.S. shipyards, including yards not capable of building the Coast Guard's bigger and more complex cutters, might be interested in bidding for this program. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my remarks. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to the subcommittee's questions.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. So let's start. We gave the Coast Guard block buy authority last year, I think, right? Was it last year, Admiral Haycock? Last year, I think.
I believe that's accurate, yes.
So would you speak to what Mr. O'Rourke just said of why you didn't do block buy for the OPCs?
For the OPCs or the FRCs?
OPCs.
OPCs.
That's what you referred to, right, Mr. O'Rourke?
That's right.
OPCs.
The OPC contract we awarded last September, that contract is well on its way in terms of all the preparations and things. Making changes that late in the contract would probably have been detrimental to getting it awarded, so we didn't do it on the OPC. There are opportunities in the future, as Mr. O'Rourke has indicated, to execute block buy on the OPC, and we're looking at
How much money would you save if you would have done a block buy with the first 9? You say you bought 9, right?
Yes, sir.
I mean, starting with 9. How much money would you have saved if you would have block buyed?
My estimate is that there's more than $300 million of savings over those 9 ships that the Coast Guard is currently on a track toward foregoing. You could recapture much of that savings by putting most of those first 9 ships under a block buy contract rather than simply waiting for that contract to be fully implemented over several years and then starting with ship 10.
let's just stay on this. Well, why would you not do that? I think this is kind of indicative of what happens with the Coast Guard in general, and what we put these authorities in there for you to have the authority to purchase ships like the Navy does. This is why we put it in there. So even, and your argument was, not yours, but the Coast Guard's argument was 4 years ago or 3 years ago, we don't have the authority, we don't have the authority. So we have to spend money that we don't have, basically, and not save. So we gave Coast Guard the authority. So they're just like the Navy now, and then once they have the authority, you choose to not use it. I mean, $300 million is, for Coast Guard, a lot of money.
Yes, sir. It's not that we're choosing not to use it. I think the Coast Guard, we want to save money, Mr. Chairman, and that's we consider ourselves to be good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. The issue is that it's a very attractive of opportunity, but it also underplays some of the risks involved. So the Coast Guard is open to any techniques and tools out there, multi-year, block buy. We're considering all those tools, and we haven't necessarily ruled any of them out. It's not that we're intentionally not using them. We want to make sure that we don't get ourselves in a situation where the risks outweigh the benefits. No one wants an acquisition to go south.
Would you explain how the risks can outweigh the benefits?
So some of the risks that we see is you are essentially, you're all in. Is what it comes down to. You're basically saying, I want a block buy for OPC, nine hulls, 9 cutters, and then if things aren't going well, you're kind of stuck. You're committed.
What do you mean if things aren't going well?
As you know, every acquisition has challenges. There's challenges in design, there's challenges in production. There's things that you can kind of foresee coming, and there's things you can't foresee coming. That's why you have acquisition professionals, highly trained people executing the acquisitions. So there are things that you just don't see, especially on first in class. And I know Mr. O'Rourke's position is it's a good tool for first in class. We're not necessarily saying that that's not the case. But our experience with first in class is the first in class oftentimes doesn't look like the rest of the fleet.
But I would offer too that the Coast Guard's shipbuilding hasn't been stellar. So what you see as first in class not being right, and what the Navy does are two different things. We're trying to, what's different with the way you build ships and the way that the Navy builds ships?
There
Do you
aren't
use special
large.
Coast Guard sauce or something? I mean, what's the difference between the Navy building ships and the Coast Guard building ships?
Not an awful lot, sir.
Then why not do what the Navy does?
We're looking at that.
Okay, but if you're looking at it, you're not doing it right. I mean, that's $300 million again is a lot of money. That's going to lead into, if I can find, you know what the numbers are for your backlog on shore, improvements and maintenance, right, and upkeep. What is that? It's a total of like 1.4 billion.
I think
1.6. It's like 700 million, and then another 800 million or something like that.
it's big, yes, sir.
Okay, so let's switch really quick. I don't want to monopolize just on the one ship, on the OPC. What do you plan on doing with that? How do you plan on paying that?
For
How do you
the
plan
shore
on paying
infrastructure?
the backlog and doing your shore facility upkeep, along with all the acquisitions? And you can't see this chart, but it basically shows which lines of ships are going to be completed when. And as you can see, the dotted line there, the gray goes up above that. Again, that's where you don't have the money to do what you say you're going to do.
So as I think this subcommittee has recognized, Mr. Chairman, is the budgets that we get for OE and for acquisition are not what they need to be. As the Commandant has previously testified, we need an annualized 5% increase in our OE and maintenance accounts. We need $2 billion in acquisition accounts to do all the things we need to do. We don't have the funding, so we have to prioritize. So that's what we do. We go through and we prioritize, look at the things that impact missions most, and try to get those accomplished first. So that's the process we use and we will continue to use.
Okay, so lastly, before I go to Mr. Garamundi, and this goes, Ms. May, I'd like you to answer this too. At what point do you realize that you have to plan for real life as opposed to planning for non-real life? Because when you gave your fleet mix analysis, I think 2 or 3 years ago, it was great. That's what we would like to see, is what you want without it being screened or changed by anybody. That's what we would like to see, so we know at least what do you need to accomplish the mission if you got 100% of what you wanted, right? Then you come back and say, well, we're not able to do that because this gets scrubbed, and here's the reality of the budget, and here's what we're going to get. At what point do these charts start matching, meaning at what point do you start planning for what you actually get? As opposed to right now, you're planning for what's unattainable because there's no money for it. But that's your plan. Your plan is to do something that's not possible. So at what point does the Coast Guard put its hands in the air and start planning to what the actual monies that you get? Does that make sense?
It does. And Mr. Chairman, that's what we're doing now. Under our current commandant, he's asked us to be bold and to look at what we really need to do the job and ask for it, and that's what we're doing.
But
So-
your 5-year plan is short, meaning you don't have enough funds for your 5-year plan, let alone your 20-year plan. Is your 20-year plan going to fall within real-life budgets? Or is it going to go way up while your money stays straight?
I'm not certain because the plan is not complete. We're still working that.
Is the 5-year plan indicative of what the 20-year plan is going to look like? Because the 5-year plan is unattainable too.
The 5-year plan is it's the 18 budget essentially, and it's constrained. Those are essentially the rules that we work under, sir.
Okay. Mr. Garamendi, you recognize.
Mr. O'Rourke, you argued strongly for a block buy. Ms. Mack, your opinion of block buy, working off Mr. O'Rourke's testimony?
Thank you. We don't believe it's wise to use block buy for the icebreaker in this particular block buy. Let me clarify. Block buy is an effective contracting mechanism for contracting in certain circumstances. In this particular case, we don't agree that this approach is valid for the same reasons using multi-year is not allowed for lead ships. When you use multi-year, the statutory criteria includes stable requirements, for example, design, and also proof of substantial savings. None of those can be proven, especially with this first polar icebreaker being built in the U.S., has not been built in over 30 years. There's a lot of things at risk, a lot of things with the design until the design's stabilized. Based on a lot of our shipbuilding work, it takes 3 to 4 ships before the requirements and design get stabilized. Given that the number's only expected to be 3 at this point, we're not advocates of using block buy for this particular acquisition.
Is there another option besides block buy as a way of moving towards 3 or 4 ships?
Annual
Yeah.
contracts with options will work and can produce savings. We've just shown that in the FRCs as well. And as well, it also gives you more congressional oversight. Once a contract's let, every year, if you have the options, if things go wrong, you can always pull it back, where with a block buy, you can't pull it back once it's paid for already. Ordering a lot of things in bulk ahead of time, and it locks us in.
Mr. O'Rourke, counter?
Yeah, there are arguments on both sides of this. The admirals and now Ms. Mack have presented the arguments for being cautious about using block buy, especially with a lead ship. Let me present the arguments on the other side so that you can have a balanced presentation. The first is that block buy was invented precisely so that you could use it on the lead ship in a program and the earliest ships in the program. The second argument is that the Navy, in fact, has done this with its own shipbuilding programs. They did it with the Virginia-class submarine, which is a ship that, with all due respect to the Coast Guard, is a lot more complex than an icebreaker. And the Navy is expected to even do this on its Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine, which, again, is a very complex ship and also a ship of a type that we have not built in decades. Thirdly, the shipyards in this country that are working toward this program are also working with the European to import their design know-how, and that will mitigate the design risk on this. Fourth, as the GAO itself has testified in the past, it is a best practice in shipbuilding to bring the design of the ship to a high stage of completion before you start building it. In fact, if you have not done that, you probably shouldn't be building the ship under any contracting arrangement at all. So if the ship has been brought to a high stage of design completion, you have mitigated the risk associated with the lead ship. In other words, the idea that lead ships present this kind of design risk is a lesson learned from the past that reflects earlier, not current best shipbuilding practices. 3 more arguments. If you do a block buy contract, it can be, and the National Academy's report recommends, that it be a fixed price incentive contract. That is protecting the government against the risk of cost growth. Secondly, if there is a need to make changes in the design of the lead ship, you would then want to measure the cost of making those changes, which should be relatively minor if you have developed the design to a high stage of completion, against the savings that you are foregoing by not having that ship under a block buy contract. And then seventh and lastly, it is not correct that you can stop a block buy contract. You can, and the cancellation penalties that the government would need to pay under that contract are less than they are under a multi-year procurement contract. So again, there are two sides of this, and the admirals and Ms. Mack have done a good job, I think, of presenting the arguments on that side. So for the sake of balance, I've given you 7 arguments on the other side.
Well, I guess we're going to get to decide. Mr. Admiral West, could you opine on this question?
Yes, sir. I have to add that we had 5 members of our committee with extensive marine architecture, marine shipbuilding experience, generations of expertise, and they're convinced the block buy is the way to go with the Icebreaker. We also heard from retired shipbuilders and shipyard owners who also agreed with us. Because we haven't built one in a long time, but the design is fixed. If you have the design, it's not a complicated mission. They're doing it now. The designs are out there. We're not going to add anything later. There's no lot of R&D involved with the design, and we think it fits the block buy concept.
Appreciate that. I think there's another factor involved in this, and that is from the point of view of, I'll speak for the Coast Guard here. They have absolutely no idea what Congress is going to give them year to year, and therefore the block buy is a concern. Ms. Mack, you're nodding your head as if that might be correct. Is that correct? Is that a factor here?
Absolutely, because if you pay the money to purchase other components earlier than the other ships are in construction, you are locked into using those components, unless, like Mr. Work mentioned, you have to pay a cancellation fee at some point. Also, I would like to note that it is a bit early to discuss what contracting type the Coast Guard is going to use when they haven't finished all the acquisition paperwork. I think more at risk is the detailed design, cost estimates, all of those documents that are required to be done before a contract is let out. And some documentation is required to be done by the end of this fiscal year to be able to award the contract in fiscal year 2019.
I suppose it's time for me to opine also, if I might. First of all, I like the idea of a block buy because it does commit the Congress to the future. And if we need 3 or 4 icebreakers, then we need to be committed. And if we can do that, now the next question really has to do with the nature of the contract itself, how you write into that contract the possibility of design changes. I suspect that there are designs and designs. There's the basic design, what this thing's going to look like, the hull and the rest, and then there are other things that will probably change over time. For example, there may be engine issues or the like, and those can be written into the contract. So, my opinion, block buy. Now, the question is 3 or 4. I'm out of time. May I take the National Academy. There being no objection, I'll continue on. The Academy recommended 4 rather than what we were looking at before, 3 heavies and 3 mediums. Can you get into this a little more detail, Admiral West, and what happens to the other 2 ships? Can we get by with 4, or do we actually need 6?
We came up with 4 for 2 reasons. One is the acquisition strategy, making it more robust, and there's all sorts of reasons why you'll get shipyards to be more engaged if they know they're going to build more than one. The second was we looked at the mission, the high latitude study, and the operational requirement the Coast Guard had come up with, and we saw the 1-0 presence in the Arctic, and we saw the McMurdo breakout, and we said you need 4 ships to do that, and that's the minimum we recommend. You can go on from there. At some point, your learning curve that each ship is cheaper will level off at some point, 4, 5, 6 down the way, and you may want to change at that point. But clearly, we thought that the 4 large were the best investment of public money for the mission right now.
So it kind of comes down to, if you're going to build an icebreaker, build a heavy because it can
Build
do
an
the job of a
icebreaker.
medium as well.
Build an icebreaker to go break ice, and, yes, sir.
You also spoke to the operational cost, that the operational costs of a new icebreaker are significantly less than the existing icebreakers. But the difference between the operational cost of a heavy icebreaker and a medium icebreaker, did you take that into account?
We did, and I don't have the exact figures, but it's not much difference. I mean, the Healy is a very large ship. In fact, it's a little bit bigger than the Polar Star. So it all depends on how much mission you put on that ship and how many people you put on it and who you embark. But the operating costs are not that much different.
And am I correct, you also recommended that all of the ships be designed for scientific purposes, but that not every ship be equipped for scientific purposes?
We decided that a ship was going to go where no other ship can go, and to regions where we don't know a heck of a lot about the oceans, that it ought to have a science capability. So in the original design, there should be a science capability designed into it for weight and space and moment, and then, which turned out to be relatively cheap. We were surprised as we costed that out if it's in the original design, rather than trying to retrofit something later on. And then if you want to outfit it, then you add the equipment later on.
It seems to me that that if we design the ship for scientific purposes, that the scientific equipment ought to be paid by the scientific organizations.
Our option allows that, where our science-ready ship is roughly 10 to 20 million in the design itself. Putting the equipment on board is additional cost, obviously, and can be charged to whoever.
Whoever wants to do that. Admiral Haycock, what do you opine on the issues of block buy and this scientific 4 versus 6?
Thank you. First, on the block buy, as Mr. Rourke had indicated that Ms. Mack and I had mounted a defense. My intention is not to mount a defense against block buy. That is not my intent. The subcommittee asked me why we seem reticent. I want to throw out there, if we have some reticence, it's because we want to make sure we've covered all the risks. It is clear that Mr. Rourke and this subcommittee are trying to avail the tools such as block buy for the Coast Guard's use, and we are excited and we appreciate that. And we are open to that, and we're looking at that. So we owe you a report in December on block buy, and we'll get that to you on time, and that will help explain some of those things. But we are open to using block buy multi-year, and we're excited about those opportunities. Regarding science, one of the things that we've been trying to do for the last 9 months since we teamed up with the Navy with our Integrated Program Office is make the icebreaker affordable. So we have taken a hard look at all the things that the icebreaker is supposed to do, and all the equipment and structure and stuff that needs to be put in place to do that. And so we have worked hard to reduce the cost of the icebreaker. So I think the initial cost estimates were a little over $1 billion. And our efforts within the Coast Guard with CG4, our tech authority for ship design and engineering and production, we've been able to reduce the cost of the icebreaker by about $200 million so far. And we're still working on that. And our industry studies, as we work with industry and learn more, we're optimistic we can bring that cost down further. One of the things that we've done is we've looked at things like science. And so the icebreaker, as currently designed from the government's indicative design perspective, has space, weight, and power reserved for changes that might occur in the future for the Coast Guard's icebreaker mission. Okay? That might be science, it might be a weapon system, it might be whatever the nation needs the icebreaker to adapt to. That's the secret behind our getting ships to last 50 years, is we build them flexibly, or we build flexibility into the design.
And you expect this detail to be available the last half of this year?
I'm not following you, sir.
Well, the actual design of the icebreaker, power, equipment, science equipment, all of that, or science space, and you expect all of that to be designed and prepared for review by the end of this year?
We have an internal design we're working that enables us to determine whether we can meet requirements and to help us estimate costs and such. The intent is not to release that to industry because we want industry to come forward with creative and innovative solutions in their designs. I don't know if that answers your
I'm really getting to the point, when do we get to see what you want to do, and when can we review that?
I'm going to have to take that back and figure that one out, sir. You know, the design continues to mature, and we're still
I was
working
looking at your schedules, and it looks to me like by the end of this year, you would expect to have the design completed and ready to go to contracts early next year.
Oh, I understand. Yeah, what you're asking is, at one point in time, will we be ready to go on contract for the detailed design, the production? So the design the government is working, the indicative design is more of an estimating tool and the ability to put reasonableness into our requirements and verify the requirements are correct and that sort of thing. What we intend to do is get a request for proposals out later next fiscal year, towards the middle of the fiscal year. That will be assigned to industry that we need them to submit proposals. With those proposals, we anticipate there would be designs, and then we would award a contract, and then industry, the team that wins would actually go through and actually formalize that design, make it final, and make it ready for production.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much for the additional time. Just a final comment. A couple of decisions are going to have to be made by us as I look at this. That is, are we going to go to 4 heavy icebreakers or 3 and 3? Right now, I think presently we're looking at 3 and 3, so this will be a change as I understand where we are. Secondly, there's the final, I'm not sure of the word final, but the design of the icebreaker itself should be available sometime in the next 6 months. Correct? And if that is the case, then I would think that Ms. Mack and Mr. O'Rourke and Rear Admiral West would like to take a look at that and give us their opinion as to whether this is the proper design, and then we would authorize either a block buy or some other mechanism for the ships. So this is kind of looking at our own work schedule out ahead, the kind of things, the decisions that we're going to have to make. And then there's this issue, much larger issue that we're going to have to deal with, and that is the overall budget for the Coast Guard, both of its acquisitions as well as for operations. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much for the additional time.
Thank you, sir. Mr. DeFazio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Haycock, you know, I just want to follow up on something you said. You're saying the first in class, you know, might meet specs, but often what comes after that is not so great. I mean, don't we write contracts well enough that if they don't meet the specifications on the second ship, that they don't get paid? I mean, what kind of contracts does the government write here? I know the 110 contracts, boy, that was pretty poorly written. I don't know why the government can't protect the taxpayers better. So why would you say, well, gee, we're concerned because the first in class might meet specs and be great, but after that they're going to create some crap and we're going to have to pay for it?
I think my comments may have caused you to misunderstand.
Okay.
It's not that the first in class is good and everything that follows is not. It's actually it's the opposite. The first in class is a challenge because it's the first one you've built.
Right.
There's a lot of learning that goes into it.
Yeah, but if it comes out well in the end.
We almost always find ways to improve it and to make it more effective and more efficient and usually affordable. So the follow-on ships become better and better as they go along. Usually the first in class.
But couldn't the contract allow for design changes that are within certain parameters? I mean, you're not totally redesigning the ship between 1 and 2.
That is accurate, sir, yes. The contracts are written to provide that sort of flexibility.
Yeah.
We don't completely redesign or rewrite things.
Yeah, but I mean, you could anticipate that.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Now, Admiral West, apparently Admiral Sumkov did answer a question I had, which is, are the Russians militarizing some of their icebreakers? And the answer was yes. And my question is, I saw that analysis where you could save a lot of money, but it's an irrevocable decision. I mean, once you've not militarized the icebreakers, then you're out of luck unless you want to build a different ship or a pretty much dramatically changed ship. Don't you believe that at least some of these icebreakers should be militarized? I mean, given the potential for conflict in the Arctic.
I'm not sure, sir, to quite be honest with you. I know in the operational requirements that I saw, the Coast Guard's 15, there was some small armament there, the ability to ward off ships and take on small ships. I think you have a whole different design if you want to make it a warship and not an icebreaker. So I'm not sure.
Well, I'm not necessarily talking about a warship that is designed for war fighting, but something that is robust enough and has defensive capabilities. You know, in World War II, we were dumping, mines off the backs of, ships that weren't armed or were lightly armed to try and get the German U-boats. I mean, some sort of capability. I mean, if we're having to lead a convoy or something through the Arctic, escort ships would have to be provided. They're going to have to follow, and then if they get the icebreaker, which is whatever, lightly armed or doesn't have defensive capabilities, then they're in a tough spot.
I think the operational concept for a icebreaker in a wartime environment is an interesting study that should be done.
Okay.
But right now, the ships that are being designed do not have that capability.
Okay, all right. Study that needs to be done. All right, that's something to take under consideration. Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank the gentleman. Let's stay on this. Again, DOD's made it clear that there is no national security, national defense requirement for an icebreaker. So why would you militarize it? I understand what the ranking member's point is, but the Department of Defense, General Dunford, I've asked him this, and he said there is no requirement in any operational plan anywhere in the world for an icebreaker. Go ahead, please. Comment, opine.
I can't add to that, sir.
Admiral Haycock?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know that I could state any better than the Commandant did in the first testimony. I don't understand why people don't see it that way. The Coast Guard has been doing defensive or national defense-related missions since 1790, as the Commandant's indicated.
I'm saying, according to the Department of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the U.S. Navy, there's no military requirement right now for an icebreaker. That's just for an icebreaker by itself, let alone a militarized icebreaker.
I don't know what else to tell you, sir. The Commandant made his comments earlier. I don't know why the Department of Defense doesn't see it that way.
Okay. Admiral West, let's go back to what you said about military design. Specifically, what things would you, what would you have that's more militarized and what would be commercial? Meaning, what would you pull out of the mil-spec requirements?
I think you have to first start, what's the threat do you expect up there? I mean, it's just like we do with our warships. What do you want to, is it anti-submarine warfare? Is it AA warfare? What is the threat? And then you have to build in that capability into the ship. I think that's an interesting study. What is the threat up there? I know the Russians are building ice-hardened combatants. I think the Canadians are building a DeWolf class ice-hardened combatant of some type. So there are people who are looking at combatants in the Arctic region, and we certainly should look at that. I don't think we did look at it when we designed the current icebreaker, but I think it's a good study to look at.
What do you think? I mean, is that the Coast Guard's role to look at that or the Navy's role to look at that?
I think it has to be both. I mean, usually the comm suite, the weapon suite that are provided to cutters as warships come from DOD. So it's it's an issue that they should do together.
But that study, that would be done by the Navy.
I think it ought to be done by both of them.
Okay. Ms. May, I want to come back to you. Ms. Mack, I asked you earlier at what point, and I forgot to add to get your answer. At what point does the Coast Guard start planning for real life to meet their actual budgets? As opposed for asking for everything under the sun and then having graphs like this where there's never enough money to meet their acquisition timeline and schedule.
I believe a 20-year plan hopefully will start addressing that, because that forces the Coast Guard to lay out more than the assets that are needed, that are shown in the 5-year plan. For instance, the 5-year plan doesn't cover quite a few other assets, and when you go further out with strategic planning, it has to cover more assets and be able to lay out those trade-offs that have to occur if we don't procure certain assets. And I think that's why we've been advocating for a 20-year plan, because that forces the Coast Guard to lay out all the assets that are needed, all the resources that are needed, and then lay out trade-offs. I know Commandant said earlier that DHS and OMB make certain cuts, and agree, they have to prioritize. But we have spoken to DHS and OMB since the last hearing, and they also acknowledge, as long as the Coast Guard lays out this 20-year plan with the budget constraints, they can say, if we stay at $1.2 billion for acquisition, this is what doesn't get done. They agree to that. They don't have a problem with listing out all their needs. Whether they get funded or not is a different issue, and that's the department's call and OMB's call. Agree.
Let's go back really quick, Mr. O'Rourke, about not lead materials, about block buy on the Icebreaker. Let's go through it slowly again, because you have arguments on each side of this. The Icebreaker is not a complicated ship. I think I do my little hand movements of what an Icebreaker does. It hits stuff, then it goes down, then it backs up, then it hits stuff, then it goes down, and it backs up, and it hits stuff, so on and so on, ad nauseum. And that's what an Icebreaker does. To me, it's almost, besides the technical aspects of bending really thick steel and the way that the boat is designed, beyond that, it's a very untechnical ship. So could you speak to that? If you were to do a block buy starting with the first ship, whether it's going to be partially militarized or not, and that's decided upon beforehand, can you go through the risks associated with it if you don't start, as we're all saying, until you have 100% design and you have all of the materials, at least for the first couple ships, and if this can save you $1 billion by block buying the 3, what are the risks associated with that?
Right, there is some complexity in the Icebreaker. It's more complex than something like a military sea lift ship, that would be similar to a commercial cargo ship, but it's not a highly complex ship. We're not talking about, a submarine that goes down to pressure depth and has a nuclear reactor on board, and also a lot of weapons and complex electronics. So it is not a highly complex ship. Furthermore, there is a lot of design know-how available on Icebreakers, even though they have not been built in this country in some time. A lot of other people have been building them all along, and they have accumulated quite a lot of design know-how. And the shipyards in this country that are interested in this program have access to that, and they can choose to partner.
They would partner with
these, and some of them already have. You can import that design know-how into it to mitigate the risk. And but lastly,
let's stop there, though. Your point there, I think, needs to be made. It's really not a first-in-class ship. It might be for us, but it's really not. Especially if you bring over the Norwegians and they're in your yard with you and they look at everything. It's really not a first-in-class ship. It's number 27. It's just being built in a U.S. yard as opposed to a Norwegian yard.
To the extent that you follow a foreign design, yeah, that becomes more and more true. It depends on exactly how much of the foreign design is incorporated into the U.S. design. But as a matter of philosophy, if you think there's risk in the design of that ship, you shouldn't be building it anyway. Best practices are to develop the design to a high state of completion and confidence in that design before you start bending metal. This is one of the major lessons of shipbuilding, and it's not a new one. It goes back some number of years. So if you think there's risk in that design, then why are you contemplating even starting the construction of that ship under any circumstances? But lastly, let's say you need to make some changes in the design as you work your way through the construction process. What is the cost of making those changes, and how does that compare to the savings of having put that ship under the block buy contract? That is what you need to weigh. There may be some changes you want to put onto that first ship, and that may cost you some amount of money. But that cost could be a lot less than the savings that you will give up by not putting that ship under the block buy contract in the first place. And I think that needs to be weighed in the balance. If you build the first ship outside the block buy contract and then wait until it's complete, you will not only, before committing to a block buy for the follow ships, you will not only forego the savings on the first ship, you will then put an interval between that first ship and the second ship that will give you a loss of learning and a poor production learning curve, and you will lose the savings in moving from ship number 1 to ship number 2 as well.
What I'm kind of seeing here, and this is just me being a conspiracy theorist, but after watching the Coast Guard for a couple of years, if you do a block buy or a multi-year contract, basically and it's approved, the Coast Guard is getting a long-term commitment by the government, by OMB, by Homeland Security, and by the appropriators, by this Congress. That's what a block buy contract signals, number one. Not only is it just good fiscally, but it signals a long-term funding commitment to you guys. I think that's why you didn't use it for the OPCs. I think that's why. I don't think that OMB wants you to have a long-term show of faith from the government. Because if you do that, then they're going to be 100% committed, because that's what a block buy is, right? Would you like to speak to that, Mr. Haycock? Or Admiral Haycock, I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. The thought of having a commitment to building 3 or 4 or 6 or however many icebreakers is exciting, and we're looking forward to that. I think the thing that we need to keep in mind is it's not just the OMB or the department that's signed up for the commitment. It's also Congress as well. And one of the things that we learn early on is you want to be careful about tying the hands of future Congresses. And so we're trying to be respectful of the way business is done. So we're excited about making this a priority in the commitment up front, and the commitment it shows to industry that this is real and that the nation is going to build multiple icebreakers. They can get their arms around that. That makes them serious. That makes them competitive. And it spurs innovation. So we're going to get unique designs that are going to be able to meet our needs and hopefully affordable. If I could just take a second, sort of clear up a misconception, however. I've heard a number of people, I've been dealing with this for about 9 months now. There's a misconception, sir, that an icebreaker is, it's really simple, it's not complex, and I would agree in general, it's not rocket science, okay? That we're not building a submarine, okay, by any means. But I think people need to understand that we don't need an icebreaker. We need a Coast Guard cutter that can break ice so it can get to the places it has missions. It doesn't make sense to go up to the Arctic and just break ice. In fact, some people might not like that, environmentalists, that sort of thing, okay? We need the icebreaker because there's a mission to perform somewhere in the high latitudes. Maybe it's responding to a search and rescue case because of increased tourism. Maybe it's responding to an environmental spill of some sort because of oil exploration or mineral exploration on the seabed. Maybe it's a national defense mission of some sort. Okay, maybe it's mapping the seabed and preparing and making our sovereignty claims, that sort of thing. The point is, there's a mission that we need to accomplish, and the ice is in the way. So we need to break the ice to get to where we need to conduct our missions. Just breaking ice for the sake of breaking ice may occur domestically because we need to clear ports and keep them free for commerce. But in the high latitudes, it's generally because we have a mission we have to accomplish someplace, and we need the icebreaker to do it. And so that's why it's not just a simple icebreaker. It's a Coast Guard cutter that has the ability to break ice. So it won't be a complex cutter like a national security cutter. Likely, it'll be something less. But the Coast Guard missions that we need to accomplish in terms of communications with other authorities, state, local, tribal, et cetera, all those things need to be rolled into the icebreaker.
Well, we're not saying you're not going to have comms on the icebreaker or a skiff or something. That's not what we're saying, right? We're talking about the complexity that you choose to build for departments that are not the Coast Guard. Whether it's science stuff or militarization, as you know, the Coast Guard's a jack of all trades, master of some, But if you want to make the icebreaker everything to everybody, it'll be master of none. And it'll be massively expensive. If you add in all those things with the possible missions that coincide with your 11 statutory missions, and you try to put those all in an icebreaker, your costs are going to go up massively. I don't even know what those numbers would be, but I'm sure you guys have taken a look at if you got everything that you wanted on an icebreaker, what it would cost. It'd be over the $1 billion, right?
We concur, sir, and that's been our effort over the last 9 months, is bringing that cost down.
So you're saying here's all the stuff we wanted, now we're going to cut it down to what we can afford?
We're trying to cut out the things that don't have major mission impact. That's really what we're going after. Some of the cost savings that we've identified is also from the maturation of the actual cost model itself. So as all those things mature, we get more confident in the number, and the number comes down.
And you told Mr. Garamundi you're going to have the design by the end of the year or the next 6 months, year, right?
I think
that was
that also is a misunderstanding.
okay.
So we'll get the designs when the industry teams submit their proposals for the detailed design and construction. I don't know if that makes sense.
Because what I'd like to get before that are your requirements. Because you said here's the $1.5 billion ship. We have to whittle that down. When will you have your requirements to give the subcommittee for what you've whittled it down to?
So we had an operational requirements document that was signed, I think, this past January, I believe, and so we're going to do a revision to that document. Some of the changes that have been made to our internal indicative design, most of them are kind of buried in the engineering requirements as opposed to top-level operational requirements. So I think you're going to find that the icebreaker will meet virtually all the needs we need to meet. But the savings and stuff are some of the details, like Admiral West was talking about using commercial versus military specifications. We've gone through, and that has been part of the calculus that has got us to our $200 million savings so far, is looking at those requirements and say, which ones do we really have to have as a military specification, which ones can we go commercial?
But you could add, if you build block buy into your planning, you could add some of those requirements back because of the money that you save. Or you can use the money to go on to the next ship, too. Are you, in your planning for your design, or are you building the block buy? Are you assuming a block buy in your calculations?
That
either saves you money or not, right?
Yes, sir. That is part of the calculus. Through the foresight of this subcommittee, we have the Navy on our team in our integrated program office. The Navy, as Mr. O'Rourke has indicated, has done this many times, and so we're listening to their counsel and taking things into consideration, some of the best practices they've put into place. I think one of the things we haven't talked about is some of the acquisition processes that we've borrowed from the Navy that we're folding into our process. So we're learning from our engagement with the Navy, and block buy is certainly one of those.
That's all I have. Mr. Garamundi, any closing thoughts?
I think I just heard you say closing thoughts, which gives me some indication that we're about to wrap up here. Within the next 6 months, this committee and Congress are going to have to make some final decisions about the icebreakers. I think, Mr. Chairman, a closing thought is one that came up in the discussion a few minutes ago, well, maybe 20 minutes ago, and that is we should, since both of us are on the Sea Power Subcommittee, we should ask that subcommittee to ask the U.S. Navy, are there any military requirements for the U.S. Navy in the Arctic? It'll be interesting to see what they have to say as to that. So I'm going to carry that forward. I want to thank the National Academy of Science for a very detailed study here that provides direction on most of the questions that we've asked. So over the next several months, probably the next 6 months, we're going to be moving towards the finalization of a icebreaker strategy for the United States. We're almost there. The question of three heavies and 3 lights, or 4 heavies, remains to be decided, and it's a critical question that we're going to have to answer here. The arguments made by the National Science Foundation are important and perhaps provide us with the final answer. Ms. Mack, we're going to have to take a look at the question of block buy. I think the answer to that is going to lie in the nature of the contract itself and the design going into a block buy. Also, I think, Mr. O'Rourke, you came up with this issue of the first one that hits the waves and gets into the water will be tested, and then the second, third, or maybe fourth one will then be modified based upon the testing sea trials, is that the word?
Acceptance
or ice
trials.
trials or whatever.
Testing.
And
There's
then
lots of
whatever-
phases of that. They go by different names.
Okay.
I just wanted to add one small point to what I said earlier. It was pointed out that under a block buy, you might make a commitment to get components up front for all the ships covered under the block buy, and that this could pose a risk if you decide to change the design or not get the follow ships. But that's only true if your block buy contract is using EOQ purchases and buying those things up front. You can still do the block buy without that. It doesn't save as much as a block buy that does use EOQ purchases, but it still saves. So if you're concerned about the risk of buying components and materials that may not work out for follow ships, you can get rid of that risk and still do the block buy contract and still save money.
Well, once again, it depends upon what those specific items are. Some are very, very well known and very low risk. Others are unique and would have a high risk. And so again, that goes to the contract itself and the sufficiency of the contract. My final point is to Admiral Haycock. You have been unable to deliver to us a viable 5-year plan, noting what was given to us late last night, which really does not meet what we're already committed to build. For example, icebreakers. I want to believe that the Coast Guard actually knows what it needs to do over the next 5 and 20 years, but that you have been prohibited from giving us that information by the Office of Management and Budget. That is a problem that I cannot accept. And it's one that I'm going to, hopefully, I'm sure with the support of the chairman, try to see if there is some way for us to get information on what is a real 5-year and 20-year program for the Coast Guard on the acquisition as well as for the operational. Presumably, these new icebreakers will need personnel and fuel, and we'll have to build that into the operating budgets going forward. So, Admiral Haycock, I, for one, will be pressing hard for a 20-year budget. It can be informal. It can be handed to us over the transom late at night or any other mechanism that might be used. I will note that the U.S. Navy uses an informal mechanism to deliver information to us in a variety of ways, as does the Air Force. I'll let it go at that, Mr. Chairman. A very, very helpful and useful meeting. Thank you very much for structuring it. Thank you.
Thank the ranking member. This has been a fun 2.5 hours. I'd like to thank the few members that came and participated, and you, the panel. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And with that, we're adjourned.